On the morning of October 26, 1942, Commander Tameichi Hara stood on the bridge of the destroyer Amatsukaze, watching smoke rise from the American carrier Hornet. The ship was listing heavily to starboard, fires raging across her flight deck. Japanese torpedo bombers had put at least 4 torpedoes into her hull. Dive bombers had struck her with at least 3 bombs. She was dying. Hara had participated in the attack that morning as part of Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's striking force. The battle had been vicious, fought in the waters northeast of the Santa Cruz Islands. American and Japanese carrier aircraft had crossed paths in the pre-dawn darkness, each hunting the other's fleet. When they found their targets, the attacks were devastating on both sides. But from Hara's perspective, watching the Hornet burn, Japan was winning. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Americans had already lost the Lexington at Coral Sea in May. They had lost the Yorktown at Midway in June. Now the Hornet was going down. That was 3 fleet carriers in 5 months. The American carrier force was being destroyed faster than any nation could replace such complex, expensive warships. Japanese naval intelligence estimated the Americans had perhaps 5 or 6 fleet carriers remaining in the entire Pacific. Japan had lost carriers too, the light carrier Shoho at Coral Sea, and 4 fleet carriers at Midway, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The losses at Midway had been catastrophic, a disaster that shifted the strategic balance. But Japanese naval planners believed they could still win a war of attrition. The Americans would run out of carriers before Japan did. They had to. Building an aircraft carrier required years of work, massive industrial resources, and specialized shipyard facilities. The Americans couldn't simply conjure new carriers from thin air. Each loss was permanent, or at least permanent enough to matter in a war measured in months and years, not decades. This calculation seemed reasonable. It was based on everything Japanese naval planners knew about shipbuilding, about American industrial capacity, about the time required to design, construct, and commission a fleet carrier. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know standing in the waters off Santa Cruz watching the Hornet die, was that their fundamental assumptions about American production capability were completely wrong. Not slightly wrong, not off by a factor of 10 or 20%. Wrong in ways that would have seemed physically impossible to any reasonable observer using the standards of naval construction that had existed for the previous 50 years. The story of what happened next is not really about carriers. It's about the moment when one nation discovered that the rules of industrial warfare had changed, that the opponent they thought they understood was playing an entirely different game with entirely different capabilities. It's about the psychological impact of watching mathematical certainty collapse into irrelevance. And it begins not with American shipyards, but with Japanese confidence born from genuine success. Japanese carrier aviation doctrine in 1942 represented the culmination of 20 years of careful development. The Imperial Japanese Navy had recognized earlier than most naval powers that aircraft carriers would become the decisive weapons of Pacific warfare. While other nations debated whether battleships or carriers should receive priority, Japan committed to carrier development with singular focus. The Kido Butai, Japan's first air fleet, was the most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled when war began in December 1941. 6 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, operating together with hundreds of aircraft and crews trained to levels of proficiency that American pilots wouldn't match until 1943. These weren't experimental units feeling their way toward new doctrine. They were veteran formations with years of combat experience from China and extensive training in coordinated strikes. The doctrine was elegant. Carriers would operate together, concentrating their striking power to overwhelm enemy defenses. Aircraft would launch in massive coordinated strikes, with fighters providing escort, dive bombers attacking from high altitude, and torpedo bombers approaching at wave-top level. The defenses of any target would be saturated by attacks coming simultaneously from multiple directions at multiple altitudes. Individual ships, even individual carrier groups, would be destroyed before they could effectively respond. This doctrine had worked perfectly at Pearl Harbor, where Japanese carrier aircraft destroyed the American battle line in a single morning. It had worked in the Indian Ocean in April 1942, when Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carriers found and sank the British carrier Hermes, the heavy cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire, and forced the British Eastern Fleet to retreat to East Africa. It had worked in dozens of smaller engagements across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Japanese naval aviators were among the best in the world. Pilot training programs were rigorous, with only the most capable candidates making it through. Aircrew for carriers underwent additional specialized training in carrier operations, navigation over water, and coordinated attack tactics. By the time a pilot joined a carrier air group, he had typically accumulated hundreds of hours of flight time and was proficient in all aspects of carrier aviation. The aircraft themselves were competitive with anything the Americans fielded in early 1942. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter was faster and more maneuverable than the American F-4F Wildcat. The Aichi D-3A dive bomber, called Val by the Americans, was accurate and reliable. The Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber, called Kate, could deliver the Type 91 torpedo, one of the most effective aerial torpedoes in any nation's arsenal. Japanese torpedoes deserve particular mention. While American torpedoes were plagued by defects that wouldn't be fully corrected until 1943, Japanese torpedoes worked reliably. The Type 91 could be dropped from aircraft at higher speeds and shallower depths than American torpedoes. It ran straight, it detonated properly, and it could sink capital ships. At Pearl Harbor, it was these torpedoes more than bombs that destroyed American battleships. So when Commander Hara watched the Hornet burning off Santa Cruz, he was watching the validation of Japanese naval doctrine. Carriers were indeed the decisive weapons. Concentrated carrier strikes could overwhelm any defense, and most importantly, America's carrier force was being systematically destroyed. Japan had lost 4 carriers at Midway, true, but that was one battle, one terrible day where luck and American code-breaking had caught the Kido Butai vulnerable. It was an aberration, not a pattern. The overall trend was clear. Japanese forces were sinking American carriers faster than they could be replaced. Vice Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, understood carrier warfare as well as any man alive. He had opposed war with the United States, famously telling Prince Konoye that he could run wild for 6 months to a year, but had utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year. Yamamoto understood industrial capacity. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington in the 1920s. He had seen American factories, American oil fields, American automobile production. But even Yamamoto, with his knowledge of American industrial potential, believed carrier losses would constrain American options. Building a fleet carrier was an enormous undertaking. The ship itself was just the beginning. You needed the aircraft, hundreds of them, because carriers went through aircraft quickly in combat operations. You needed trained pilots, thousands of them, because pilot casualties were even higher than aircraft losses. You needed escort vessels, destroyers, and cruisers to protect the carrier. You needed supply ships, oilers to refuel the task force, ammunition ships to replace expended ordnance. You needed port facilities capable of servicing and repairing such complex vessels. Most critically, you needed time. In October 1942, the fastest any nation had ever built a fleet carrier from keel laying to commissioning was approximately 3 years. The Shokaku had taken 2 years and 8 months from keel to commissioning. The American carriers Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet had each required similar time frames. These were not ships that could be rushed. The complexity of the systems, the precision required in construction, the testing and trials before the ship could be declared operational, all of this took time. Japanese naval intelligence maintained detailed files on American shipbuilding capacity. They knew which yards could build carriers. Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia had built the Yorktown and Enterprise. New York Naval Shipyard had built the Hornet. Brooklyn Navy Yard had capacity. Philadelphia Naval Yard was expanding. But these were specialized facilities. You couldn't build carriers in ordinary commercial shipyards. The slipways had to be large enough. The cranes had to be powerful enough. The workforce had to be skilled enough. Intelligence estimates in October 1942 suggested the Americans might have 6 to 8 carriers under construction. Some of these would be light carriers, smaller vessels with reduced aircraft capacity. Perhaps 3 or 4 fleet carriers might be approaching completion. Even if the Americans pushed these ships through at unprecedented speed, they wouldn't enter service until late 1943 at the earliest. More likely, 1944. And by then, Japan would have replaced its Midway losses and potentially sunk more American carriers. The mathematics seemed to favor Japan. The Imperial Navy had started the war with 10 carriers, 6 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers. They had lost 5 at Midway and Coral Sea. But new construction was proceeding. The Taiho, incorporating lessons learned from combat, was under construction. The Shinano, originally planned as a battleship, was being converted to a carrier. Smaller carriers were being built from converted passenger liners and support ships. Japan would have 12 to 15 carriers by 1944. If the Americans continued losing carriers at the rate of 1 every 2 months, they would be down to perhaps 2 or 3 operational carriers by mid-1943. This would be catastrophic for American offensive operations. You couldn't sustain major campaigns across the vast Pacific with only 2 or 3 carriers. The distances were too great. The Japanese fortified islands too numerous. American strategy would have to shift to defensive operations, perhaps eventually to negotiating a settlement that left Japan in control of its conquered territories. This was the calculation. This was the foundation on which Japanese strategy rested. And in October 1942, watching the Hornet sink beneath the waves, it seemed entirely reasonable. What the Japanese didn't know, what they had no way of knowing, was that American shipyards were already producing carriers in ways that violated every historical precedent for naval construction. The first of these new carriers would be commissioned in just 63 days. The Essex-class carrier program had begun not as a response to Pearl Harbor, but as a peacetime expansion of American naval power. On July 17, 1940, more than a year before the United States entered the war, Congress authorized construction of 11 new fleet carriers under the Two-Ocean Navy Act. The lead ship, USS Essex, had her keel laid at Newport News Shipbuilding on April 28, 1941. This timing was critical. When Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Essex was already 7 months into construction. She wasn't a response to war. She was a program that happened to be underway when war began, and the infrastructure, the planning, the workforce training, all of that was already in motion. Newport News Shipbuilding occupied over 600 acres on the Virginia coast. The facility had been building warships since 1886. It had constructed the carriers Yorktown and Enterprise in the 1930s, giving the workforce direct experience with carrier construction. When the Essex program began, the yard didn't have to learn carrier building from scratch. They were refining and accelerating processes they already understood. The Essex-class design itself represented a critical decision point. Naval architects at the Bureau of Ships could have designed each carrier as a unique vessel, incorporating the latest innovations and lessons learned. Instead, they created a standardized design that could be replicated across multiple shipyards with minimal variation. This was revolutionary for capital ship construction. The Essex-class carriers would displace 47,500 tons fully loaded. They would measure 872 feet in length, with a flight deck 147 feet wide. They would carry 90 to 100 aircraft, more than any previous American carrier. But most importantly, every Essex-class carrier would be built to identical specifications using identical construction methods. This standardization extended to every level of production. Steel plates were cut to standard dimensions at steel mills before being shipped to shipyards. Compartments were prefabricated in sections, then assembled on the slipway. Equipment installations followed identical sequences across all ships. Workers could move between carriers under construction and immediately understand the layout because every ship was the same. The workforce expansion was equally systematic. Newport News employed approximately 11,000 workers when the Essex keel was laid in April 1941. By December 1942, that number had grown to 28,000. These weren't just men pulled from unemployment lines and handed welding torches. The shipyard established training programs, taking people with no shipbuilding experience and teaching them specific tasks through structured instruction. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Before the war, shipbuilding had been almost exclusively male. By 1943, women comprised nearly 20% of the workforce at major naval shipyards. They welded hull plates, installed electrical systems, assembled equipment, and performed every task except the heaviest physical labor. The assumption that shipbuilding required male physical strength proved largely incorrect. Most tasks required skill and precision, not brute force. The shipyard operated 3 shifts, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. Night shifts worked under floodlights that turned the yards into daylight. The sound of construction never stopped. Riveting hammers, welding arcs, crane operations, steel plates being moved and positioned, all of this continued around the clock. Productivity was measured not in months, but in hours. Every delay was analyzed, every bottleneck was addressed. Supply chains were reorganized to support accelerated construction. Steel mills prioritized naval contracts. Engine manufacturers allocated production capacity to carrier power plants. Electronics firms produced radar systems, radio equipment, and fire control computers. The industrial mobilization wasn't just about one shipyard building one carrier. It was about coordinating thousands of suppliers across the entire American economy. The Essex was commissioned on December 31, 1942, just 20 months after her keel was laid. This was fast, faster than any previous American fleet carrier. But she was just the beginning. Behind her on the slipways at Newport News was the Yorktown, named for the carrier lost at Midway. Behind Yorktown was the Intrepid. At other yards, more Essex-class carriers were taking shape. Brooklyn Navy Yard was building the Bonhomme Richard and the Kearsarge. Fall River Shipyard in Massachusetts was building the Wasp, named for the carrier sunk off Guadalcanal in September 1942, and the Hancock. Philadelphia Naval Shipyard was building the Antietam. Norfolk Navy Yard was building the Lake Champlain and the Tarawa. The industrial system wasn't building carriers one at a time. It was building them simultaneously, with multiple ships at various stages of completion across multiple yards. By the end of 1942, 8 Essex-class carriers were under construction. By mid-1943, that number would reach 17. The program that Japanese intelligence believed would produce perhaps 3 or 4 carriers by late 1943 was actually going to produce more than a dozen by the end of that year. The gap between Japanese assumptions and American reality was about to become visible. The USS Lexington, the second Essex-class carrier to be commissioned, completed the journey from keel laying to commissioning in just 17 months. Her keel was laid at Fall River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, on July 15, 1941. She was commissioned on February 17, 1943. The name honored the carrier lost at Coral Sea 9 months earlier. The replacement had been completed faster than Japanese intelligence thought possible. Japanese naval planners received reports of American carrier construction through multiple intelligence channels. Neutral diplomats observed shipyard activities. Reconnaissance aircraft occasionally photographed American ports. Signal intelligence intercepted American naval communications. The reports were consistent and deeply troubling. The Americans were commissioning new carriers at impossible rates. In Tokyo, naval staff officers checked the reports against their understanding of shipbuilding. 17 months from keel to commissioning was already extraordinary. But the Americans weren't stopping there. The Bunker Hill was commissioned in May 1943, just 16 months after her keel was laid. The Wasp followed in November, also 16 months from keel to commissioning. The construction time was decreasing as shipyards refined their processes. Captain Atsushi Oi, serving on the staff of the combined fleet, later wrote that the intelligence reports seemed incredible. American shipyards were commissioning a new Essex-class carrier approximately every 8 weeks. This violated everything the Imperial Navy understood about carrier construction. The Shokaku-class carriers, Japan's most modern fleet carriers at the war's start, had required 32 months from keel to commissioning. The Americans were building comparable ships in half that time, but the reports were verified. American radio broadcasts announced carrier commissionings. American newspapers published photographs of the ceremonies. There was no deception, no intelligence failure. The Americans were genuinely producing carriers at rates that seemed to belong to science fiction rather than industrial reality. The implications were catastrophic for Japanese strategy. If the Americans could build a fleet carrier in 16 months, then every carrier Japan sank would be replaced within a year and a half. But the Americans had multiple carriers under construction simultaneously. They weren't replacing losses one for one, they were expanding their carrier force even while absorbing combat losses. Japanese shipbuilding capacity couldn't match this pace. Japan's largest naval shipyards, Kure, Yokosuka, Sasebo, and Nagasaki, were building carriers, but at traditional timescales. The Taiho, Japan's most advanced carrier design, had her keel laid in July 1941, the same month as the Lexington. The Taiho wouldn't be commissioned until March 1944, 33 months later. By the time Japan commissioned one advanced carrier, the Americans would have commissioned more than a dozen. The mathematical reality was inescapable. Japan began the war with 10 carriers and had planned to expand to perhaps 15 by 1944. The United States had 7 carriers at the start of the war, lost 4 in 1942, but would have more than 20 by the end of 1943. The carrier force ratio, which had favored Japan in December 1941, would favor the Americans by approximately 2-1 by the end of 1943, and the gap would only widen thereafter. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Resource allocation made the disparity even worse. Each Essex-class carrier required approximately 47,000 tons of steel. American steel production in 1943 reached 80 million tons. The Americans could allocate a fraction of 1% of their steel production to carriers and still outbuild Japan's entire naval construction program. Japanese steel production in 1943 was approximately 7 million tons, less than 1/10 of American output, and that steel had to be divided between the Navy, the Army, merchant shipping, and civilian needs. Labor presented similar constraints. American shipyards employed hundreds of thousands of workers and could expand that workforce by recruiting women and training new workers through systematic programs. Japanese shipyards employed skilled craftsmen whose numbers couldn't be rapidly expanded. Traditional Japanese shipbuilding relied on experienced workers for critical tasks. The Americans had systematized construction to the point where relatively inexperienced workers could perform most operations after brief training. The efficiency gains from standardization were equally important. Every Essex-class carrier used the same engines, the same boilers, the same propeller shafts, the same electrical systems, the same aviation fuel systems, the same weapons mounts. Suppliers could produce these components in quantity, reducing costs and delivery times. Workers became expert at installing specific systems because they installed the same systems on ship after ship. Quality improved because problems identified on one ship could be corrected across the entire program. Japanese carriers were more individualized. The Shokaku and Zuikaku were similar but not identical. The Taiho incorporated numerous innovations that required custom fabrication. The Shinano, being converted from a battleship hull, was unique. Each ship required custom solutions for various systems, reducing production efficiency and increasing construction time. What the Americans gained through standardization, the Japanese lost through customization. On June 19, 1944, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Japanese mobile fleet approaching the Mariana Islands. His force included 9 carriers, the fleet carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, the light carriers Chitose, Chiyoda, Zuiho, Ryuho, Junyo, and Hio. These 9 carriers embarked 473 aircraft and represented the largest carrier striking force Japan had assembled since Midway 2 years earlier. Ozawa knew he faced a larger American force, but Japanese doctrine emphasized quality over quantity. His pilots would strike first, at longer range than American aircraft could match. They would use land bases in the Marianas for rearming and refueling, allowing multiple strike waves. The Americans would be destroyed through coordinated attacks before their numerical superiority could matter. This was the same doctrine that had worked at Pearl Harbor, at Ceylon, in the early campaigns. It should work again. What Ozawa didn't fully comprehend was the force he was approaching. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded Task Force 58, the American fast carrier force. Mitcher had 15 carriers, 7 Essex-class fleet carriers, Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Wasp, Bunker Hill, and Lexington, plus 8 light carriers of the Independence class. These carriers embarked 931 aircraft. The numerical disparity was nearly 2-to-1 in aircraft, more than that in carriers. But numbers were only part of the disparity. American carrier doctrine had evolved significantly since 1942. Task Force 58 operated as an integrated force with sophisticated fighter direction. Radar-equipped ships detected incoming raids at ranges exceeding 100 miles. Fighter directors vectored combat air patrols to intercept raids before they reached the fleet. The Americans had developed a defensive system that Japanese doctrine hadn't anticipated. American aircraft had improved dramatically. The F-6F Hellcat fighter was faster, tougher, and more heavily armed than the Zero. American pilots in 1944 had better training, better tactics, and more combat experience than their counterparts in 1942. The SB-2C Helldiver and TBF Avenger represented the most modern carrier aircraft in service anywhere. American ordnance worked reliably, including torpedoes that had finally been corrected after 2 years of defects. The battle began at 10:23 in the morning, when American radar detected the first Japanese strike wave. 15 F-6F Hellcats from Essex were vectored to intercept. They found 45 Japanese aircraft, mostly Zeros and torpedo bombers, at 11,000 feet. The Hellcats dove through the formation, guns firing. In the first pass, they shot down 16 Japanese aircraft. The survivors scattered, losing formation integrity. More American fighters arrived as additional Japanese raids were detected. The airspace west of the American task force became a vast aerial battlefield with hundreds of aircraft engaged. Japanese pilots found themselves outnumbered and outclassed. The Hellcats had better high-altitude performance, better diving speed, and better firepower. American pilots used speed and power to dictate engagement terms, diving on Japanese formations, firing, then climbing away before the more maneuverable Zeros could respond. By early afternoon, Japanese losses were catastrophic. Of the 373 aircraft Ozawa launched in 4 major raids, approximately 240 were shot down. Most never reached the American carriers. Those that penetrated the fighter screen faced intense anti-aircraft fire from American ships equipped with radar-directed 5-inch guns and automatic 40mm and 20mm weapons. The few hits achieved caused minor damage. No American carriers were sunk. No American carriers were even seriously damaged. Meanwhile, American submarines operating west of the Marianas detected the Japanese carrier force. USS Albacore fired a spread of torpedoes at the Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier. One torpedo struck forward of the island superstructure. The damage seemed manageable initially, but aviation fuel vapor from ruptured tanks accumulated in the ship's enclosed hangars. At 3:32 in the afternoon, the vapor ignited. The explosion tore through the ship. The Taiho sank at 4:28, taking approximately 1,600 crew with her. USS Kavala found the Shokaku, one of the 2 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Kavala fired 6 torpedoes. 3 struck the Shokaku on her starboard side. Uncontrolled fires reached aviation fuel and munitions. The carrier exploded and sank at 3:01 in the afternoon. 1,263 crew died. American pilots called the battle the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name was crude but accurate. Japanese aircraft had been slaughtered. In one day of combat, the Imperial Navy lost approximately 600 aircraft and 2 fleet carriers. The Americans lost 30 aircraft in combat and 43 in operational accidents. No American carriers were lost. For Japanese naval aviation, the Battle of Philippine Sea was more than a defeat. It was proof that the war was lost. The Americans had more carriers, better aircraft, better trained pilots, and overwhelming material superiority. The 9 Japanese carriers at Philippine Sea represented the majority of Japan's operational carrier force. The 15 American carriers at Philippine Sea represented less than half of the carriers the United States had in service, with more commissioning every month. Admiral Ozawa withdrew his surviving carriers after the Battle of Philippine Sea. The mobile fleet had been shattered as an offensive force. Of the 473 aircraft embarked on his carriers at the battle's start, fewer than 100 returned. Pilot losses were even more catastrophic than aircraft losses. Experienced aircrew who had survived years of combat were dead, along with the partially trained replacements who had been rushed through abbreviated training programs to fill depleted squadrons. The Japanese carrier force would never recover, not because the ships themselves couldn't be repaired or replaced, but because the pilots couldn't be replaced. Training a carrier pilot required months of instruction, hundreds of hours of flight time, and extensive practice in the difficult arts of navigation, over water, carrier landings, and coordinated attack tactics. Japan's fuel supplies were increasingly constrained by American submarine warfare. Training flights had to be curtailed. New pilots went to operational squadrons with minimal preparation, sometimes with less than 100 hours total flight time. American pilot training programs, by contrast, expanded throughout the war. Flight schools across the United States produced thousands of pilots annually. Each pilot received extensive training, often 400 to 600 hours of flight time before joining a combat squadron. Fuel for training was unlimited. Aircraft for training were abundant. When a pilot was killed in combat, the replacement had equivalent or better training. The system was sustainable. In the months following Philippine Sea, Japanese naval leadership confronted uncomfortable realities. Staff officers prepared assessments of carrier strength for Fleet Admiral Osami Nagano and Admiral Shigetaro Shimada, the Navy Minister. The numbers were grim. Japan had 6 carriers operational after Philippine Sea: Zuikaku, Junyo, Hyo, Ryuho, and the light carriers Chitose and Chiyoda. The Americans had more than 30 carriers in service, with additional Essex-class carriers commissioning monthly. Captain Toshikazu Omai, serving in the Naval General Staff, later wrote that by mid-1944, staff officers privately acknowledged the carrier war was lost. The Americans had achieved numerical superiority that couldn't be overcome through tactical excellence or superior fighting spirit. At planning meetings, officers still spoke optimistically about decisive battles and special attack tactics. But in private conversations, they admitted the mathematics were impossible. Japanese industrial production couldn't close the gap. The Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, was commissioned in November 1944. At 72,000 tons, she was the largest carrier ever built. But she was one ship. During the same month, the Americans commissioned 3 more Essex-class carriers: Bonhomme, Richard, Randolph, and Shangri-La. 1 Japanese carrier versus 3 American carriers, and the American carriers would be followed by more, while the Shinano would likely be Japan's last fleet carrier. The Shinano's career illustrated Japan's predicament. She was commissioned on November 19, 1944. On November 28, just 9 days later, she was torpedoed by the American submarine Archerfish while conducting sea trials. 4 torpedoes struck her starboard side. Damage control efforts failed. The Shinano sank on November 29, taking 1,435 crew and civilian workers with her. Japan's newest, largest carrier had survived just 10 days in commission. American carriers, meanwhile, operated with increasing impunity across the Pacific. Task Force 38, as the Fast Carrier Force was redesignated, after the Marianas Campaign, struck targets across the Philippines, Formosa, the Ryukyu Islands, and eventually the Japanese home islands themselves. Carrier aircraft destroyed Japanese shipping, attacked airfields, and supported amphibious landings. The carriers that Japanese planners had hoped to sink through attrition warfare were instead conducting offensive operations against Japan itself. The October 1944 Battle of Leyte Gulf represented Japan's last major carrier operation. Admiral Ozawa commanded a force of 4 carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, with just 116 aircraft embarked. The carriers were intended as bait, drawing American carrier forces away from Leyte Gulf so that Japanese surface forces could attack the invasion fleet. The plan worked in the sense that American carriers pursued Ozawa's force, but it failed strategically because American surface forces defeated the Japanese battleship groups anyway. American carrier aircraft found Ozawa's force off Cape Engano on October 25. Wave after wave of strikes hit the Japanese carriers. The Zuikaku, last surviving carrier of the Pearl Harbor attack force, sank in the afternoon. The Zuiho capsized and sank. The Chitose and Chiyoda were sunk by cruiser gunfire after being crippled by air attack. Japan's carrier force was effectively destroyed. The few remaining carriers had no aircraft and no trained pilots to fly them. The Imperial Navy had begun the war with 10 carriers and ambitious plans to expand through new construction. By the end of 1944, Japanese carriers were reduced to auxiliary roles or were being loaded with kamikaze aircraft for one-way suicide missions. The Americans had achieved total air superiority over the Pacific. The carrier force that was supposed to be destroyed through attrition had instead grown to overwhelming strength. The final Essex-class carrier statistics tell the story more clearly than any battle report. Between 1942 and 1945, American shipyards completed 24 Essex-class fleet carriers. 8 additional Essex-class carriers were under construction when the war ended, later completed for post-war service. The program that Japanese intelligence had predicted might produce 3 or 4 carriers by late 1943 actually produced 17 carriers by the end of that year, 24 by war's end. Construction times continued to decrease as shipyards refined their processes. The USS Lake Champlain was commissioned just 15 months after her keel was laid. The USS Boxer achieved commissioning in 14 months and 29 days. These timeframes represented faster construction than any other capital ships in naval history. American shipyards were building 47,000-ton fleet carriers, faster than most nations could build destroyers. The production acceleration wasn't limited to fleet carriers. The Independence-class light carriers added another dimension to American carrier superiority. These ships were converted from Cleveland-class light cruiser hulls already under construction. The conversion program was approved in January 1942. 9 Independence-class carriers were commissioned between January and December 1943, each built in approximately 15 to 18 months from conversion start to commissioning. The Independence-class carriers were smaller than Essex-class ships, displacing just 14,000 tons and carrying only 30 to 35 aircraft. But they were fast, capable of 32 knots, and operationally effective. They provided additional flight decks for Task Force 38, increasing the number of aircraft that could be launched simultaneously. And they were available in 1943 when the Americans desperately needed additional carriers to support offensive operations. Japanese carrier production, by comparison, managed to complete just 6 fleet or light carriers during the entire war after Pearl Harbor: Taiho, Shinano, Unryu, Amagi, Katsuragi, and Aso. Several escort carriers were converted from merchant ships, but these were slow, small vessels with limited combat capability. The disparity between American and Japanese production was approximately 6-to-1 in fleet carriers, greater when light carriers were included. The Essex and Independence-class programs represented just one aspect of American naval production. American shipyards simultaneously built hundreds of destroyers, dozens of cruisers, hundreds of submarines, and thousands of amphibious warfare vessels. Philadelphia Naval Shipyard built 3 Essex-class carriers, while also building cruisers and destroyers. Newport News built 4 Essex-class carriers while building battleships and cruisers. The shipyards weren't choosing between carrier construction and other programs. They were doing everything simultaneously. Japanese shipyards faced impossible choices. Building carriers meant not building battleships or cruisers. Building major warships meant fewer destroyers and submarines. Building naval vessels meant fewer merchant ships to transport resources from Southeast Asia. American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant shipping faster than it could be replaced. By 1944, resource shortages were constraining all Japanese production. Steel allocation went to the highest priority programs, which increasingly meant coastal defense and aircraft production, not carriers. The workforce disparity was equally significant. American shipyards employed more than 500,000 workers by 1944, a number that would have been inconceivable in 1941. Women comprised approximately 25% of the workforce. Training programs brought new workers to competency in weeks rather than years. Productivity per worker increased as standardization and prefabrication reduced the skill levels required for most tasks. Japanese shipyards employed approximately 75,000 workers, less than 15% of American shipyard employment. The workforce was predominantly male, older, and experienced, because Japanese cultural norms discouraged women from heavy industrial work. As the war continued and casualties mounted, the available labor pool shrank. Young men went to the military rather than the shipyards. The workforce couldn't expand to meet production demands. American industrial mobilization extended beyond shipyards to the entire supporting infrastructure. Steel mills allocated 40% of production to military needs, while maintaining civilian production at levels adequate to prevent economic disruption. Electronics manufacturers produced radar systems, radio equipment, and fire control computers in quantities sufficient to equip every carrier and every major warship. Engine manufacturers built marine steam turbines, boilers, and reduction gears for dozens of carriers simultaneously. The supply chain worked because the American economy had capacity to spare. The United States produced approximately 50% of the world's manufactured goods in 1944. That production capability could support both a massive military mobilization and civilian consumption. Rationing existed but was less severe than in other combatant nations. Americans bought war bonds, worked overtime in defense plants, and maintained one of the highest standards of living in the world, even while supporting 16 million men and women in uniform. Japan's economy, by contrast, was fully mobilized by 1942 and remained unable to meet military demands. Civilian consumption was severely restricted. Rice rations were reduced repeatedly. Industrial workers were malnourished and exhausted. The merchant fleet that transported resources from conquered territories was being destroyed by American submarines. By 1944, aluminum, steel, rubber, and petroleum were all in critical shortage. When Commander Tameichi Hara watched the Hornet burning off Santa Cruz on October 26, 1942, he believed he was witnessing American vulnerability. 3 carriers lost in 5 months suggested America's carrier force could be destroyed through sustained attrition. The calculation was reasonable based on everything Japanese planners understood about shipbuilding and industrial capacity. It was also completely wrong. The replacement carrier for the Hornet, the second ship to bear that name, was commissioned on November 29, 1943, just 13 months after the original Hornet sank. But by the time the new Hornet joined the fleet, she was one of 14 Essex and Independence-class carriers that had been commissioned that year. The Americans hadn't just replaced the Hornet. They had expanded their carrier force to levels the Japanese couldn't match, couldn't counter, and ultimately couldn't survive. The story of carrier replacement isn't really about ships or construction times. It's about the moment when Japanese naval leadership realized their fundamental assumptions were incorrect. They had assumed carrier construction required years, and that losses would be permanent enough to matter strategically. They had assumed American industrial capacity, while large, was still bound by the same constraints that limited Japanese production. They had assumed the rules of naval warfare that had existed for decades would continue to apply. All of these assumptions collapsed between 1942 and 1944. American shipyards built carriers in months, not years. American industrial capacity wasn't bound by traditional constraints because the scale of mobilization was unprecedented. The rules of naval warfare changed when one combatant could produce capital ships faster than the other side could sink them. Attrition warfare requires the enemy to run out of resources before you do. Japan was attempting attrition warfare against an opponent with effectively unlimited resources. The human cost of this miscalculation was measured in the lives of Japanese carrier pilots, skilled aircrew who flew inferior aircraft against superior numbers, and died knowing their sacrifice couldn't change the outcome. It was measured in the crews of Japanese carriers like the Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. Ships sunk not because they were poorly designed or badly handled, but because they were overwhelmingly outnumbered. It was measured in the staff officers in Tokyo who prepared increasingly desperate operational plans, knowing that tactical excellence couldn't overcome industrial disparity. For American shipyard workers, the men and women who built carriers in Detroit, Philadelphia, Newport News, and Brooklyn, the war was different. They fought with welding torches and riveting hammers, with cranes and steel plates, with systematic processes that turned raw materials into warships. Their battlefield was the slipway, their weapon was industrial production, and their victory was measured in commissioning dates and hull numbers. They won their war through organizational skill, engineering excellence, and the capacity to mobilize an entire economy toward a single purpose. The Essex-class carriers that were built in 14 to 16 months would serve for decades after World War II. Several were modified and recommissioned for service in Korea and Vietnam. The last Essex-class carrier, USS Lexington, wasn't decommissioned until 1991, 49 years after the lead ship was commissioned. These were not disposable ships built quickly and cheaply. They were properly designed, properly built fleet carriers that represented the culmination of American naval architecture and industrial capability. When the war ended in August 1945, the United States Navy operated 99 aircraft carriers of all types, Essex-class fleet carriers, Independence-class light carriers, and numerous escort carriers built on merchant hulls. The Imperial Japanese Navy operated 0 operational carriers. Every Japanese carrier had been sunk, scrapped, or was damaged beyond repair. The carrier force that was supposed to achieve victory through offensive striking power had been destroyed. The American carrier force that was supposed to be eliminated through attrition had grown to dominate every ocean. The lesson wasn't that American sailors were braver or that American admirals were smarter. The lesson was that industrial capacity determines the outcome of industrial wars. Japan challenged a nation that produced 10 times more steel, extracted 100 times more oil, and built ships at 20 times the rate. The challenge was hopeless from the beginning, though it took years of combat to demonstrate that reality. The 2 carriers lost at Santa Cruz and Coral Sea were replaced in 8 weeks, not because American shipyards rushed 2 specific ships to completion, but because American shipyards had been building carriers continuously, and those replacements happened to be ready. The production system wasn't reactive. It was systematic, planned, and executed with a competence that made carrier construction routine rather than extraordinary. That was perhaps the most devastating reality Japanese planners confronted. For the Americans, building fleet carriers had become ordinary industrial production, no more remarkable than building tanks or trucks or aircraft. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.